The sound of cards slapping against the whiskey-stained table had sealed Grace Sullivan's fate before she even knew the game was being played. She stood in the parlor of their ramshackle house outside Randsburg, California, watching her three brothers avoid her eyes as a stranger in a black coat studied a piece of paper like it was worth more than gold. The year was 1883, and the desert heat made everything shimmer with an unreal quality, but this nightmare was solid and true. "It's done then," the man in black said, folding the paper and tucking it into his vest pocket. "Miss Sullivan belongs to Luther Kane now. Payment for your daddy's debt, plus the additional 500 you boys managed to rack up last night." Grace felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. "What are you talking about? Thomas, what is he saying?" Her eldest brother Thomas finally looked at her. At 26, he should have been the man of the family after their father died 6 months ago, but his weakness for cards and whiskey had hollowed him out. "We didn't have a choice, Gracie. The debt collectors were coming. They would have taken the house, the land, everything. So you sold me instead." Her voice came out strangled, disbelieving. She looked at her other brothers, James and William, both in their early 20s, both staring at the floor like cowards. "How could you?" "Mr. Kane's a wealthy man," the man in black said, as if that made everything acceptable. "Owns half the cattle in this territory. Could have done worse." Grace's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She was 20 years old, had spent the last 3 years holding this family together after their mother passed, cooking and cleaning and trying to make their father's failing ranch work. And this was how they repaid her. This was what her life was worth to them. "When?" she asked, her voice flat. "Now," the man said. "I'll take you to him today. Let me pack my things." In her small room, Grace moved through a fog of shock and rage. She owned so little. A few dresses, all carefully mended, her mother's Bible, a locket with her parents' faces inside. She packed mechanically, her hands steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. She would not cry. She would not give her brothers the satisfaction of seeing her break. When she emerged with her single worn carpetbag, Thomas tried to approach her. "Gracie, I'm sorry. We'll make this right, I swear. We'll win enough to buy you back." She looked at him with such contempt that he actually flinched. "Don't you ever speak to me again. Any of you, you're dead to me now." The ride to Luther Kane's ranch took 3 hours through the scorching California desert. The man in black, who said his name was Simmons, didn't try to make conversation after the first few attempts, which suited Grace fine. She stared at the brown landscape, the distant mountains wavering in the heat, and tried to imagine what kind of man bought a woman to settle a debt. The Kane Ranch sprawled across the valley like a small kingdom. Cattle dotted the hills, and the main house rose 2 stories with a wide porch that wrapped around the entire structure. It was the kind of wealth Grace had only glimpsed from a distance, the kind that seemed impossible when you were darning the same dress for the 4th time. Luther Kane stood on that porch waiting. He was perhaps 50, thick around the middle, with cold eyes and a mouth that turned down naturally. He looked Grace over like she was a horse he was considering purchasing, and she felt her skin crawl. "Pretty enough," he said to Simmons. "Looks healthy, she'll do." "I'm standing right here," Grace said sharply. "I can hear you." Kane's eyes narrowed. "Got some spirit." "We'll need to train that out." He gestured to a woman in a gray dress who had appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Hendricks, take her inside. Get her cleaned up and into something decent. I'll want her presented properly at dinner." Grace found her voice. "Presented? What exactly do you think I am?" "Your property, girl. Your brothers signed you over legal and proper. You belong to me now, and you'll do as I say, or you'll find out just how unpleasant I can make things." His voice was casual, almost bored, which somehow made it worse. "Mrs. Hendricks, the housekeeper, took Grace's arm gently. "Come along, dear. Best not to make waves right off." The next 2 hours passed in a blur. Mrs. Hendricks was kind but distant, clearly not wanting to get too involved. She showed Grace to a small room off the kitchen, hardly more than a closet with a cot, and brought her a plain brown dress that was too big in some places and too tight in others. "What does he want with me?" Grace asked as Mrs. Hendricks helped her with the buttons. The older woman's hands paused, then resumed their work. "Best not to ask too many questions. Mr. Kane always gets what he wants, one way or another." Dinner was served in a formal dining room that could have seated 20. Grace sat at one end of the long table while Kane sat at the other, and he talked at her about his plans. He needed a wife, he said. Someone young enough to give him sons, someone who would be properly grateful for the opportunity. He'd paid good money for her, and he expected a return on his investment. Grace pushed food around her plate, her appetite gone. "You can't force me to marry you." "Can I?" Kane cut into his steak with precise movements. "Who's going to stop me? Your brothers. They're probably drunk in a saloon right now, spending the money I gave them." "The law. I am the law in this county, girl. I own the sheriff, the judge, and half the town council. I'll run away. Try it. I have men watching every road. Where would you go anyway? You have no money, no family worth the name, nothing. You're mine, and the sooner you accept that, the easier this will be for you." That night, locked in her tiny room, Grace finally let herself cry. Not loud, wrenching sobs, but quiet tears that slid down her cheeks as she lay on the thin mattress and stared at the ceiling. She had never felt so alone, so powerless. Everything she had believed about the world, about family, about her own worth, had been stripped away in a single day. But as the tears dried, something harder settled in her chest. Luther Kane might have bought a piece of paper, but he didn't own her. Not really. She would find a way out of this. She had to. The next morning, Kane called her into his study. Grace went with her head high, determined not to show fear. He sat behind a massive oak desk, papers spread before him, and he gestured to a chair across from him. "Sit. We need to discuss the arrangements." Grace remained standing. "There's nothing to discuss. I won't marry you." Kane's face darkened. "You're trying my patience, girl. I've been more than generous. You could be on the streets or worse. Instead, you'll have a position, security, everything you could want, except freedom, except choice. Those are luxuries. This is the real world." Before Grace could respond, there was a commotion outside. Raised voices, the sound of horses. Kane's expression shifted to annoyance, and he strode to the window. "What the devil is that fool doing here?" A moment later, the study door opened without a knock. A man walked in, and Grace's breath caught. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean, hard build of someone who worked with his body every day. He wore dusty trail clothes, a battered hat in his hands, and his face was weathered by sun and wind. But it was his eyes that struck her. They were blue, clear, and direct, and they held something she hadn't seen in a man's face in a long time: integrity. "Kane," the man said, his voice a low drawl that somehow filled the room. "Vaughn, you're not welcome here. Get out." The man, Vaughn, didn't move. His eyes had found Grace, taking in her ill-fitting dress, her defensive posture. "Heard in town you bought yourself a woman. Wanted to see if it was true. None of your damned business. This is a private matter. Doesn't seem right buying a person." "Thought we fought a war about that not so long ago." Kane's face flushed red. "She's mine legally. Her brothers signed the contract. It's all proper. Legal maybe. Proper." Vaughn looked at Grace again. "Madam, are you here of your own free will?" Grace's heart leaped. "No. My brothers sold me to settle gambling debts. I never agreed to any of this." "That's what I thought." Vaughn turned back to Kane. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to tear up that contract and let this woman go. Kane laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Or what? You'll make me. You're on my land, Vaughn. I have 20 men working this ranch, and every one of them is loyal to me. You're one man with a gun you're not even wearing. Don't need a gun to do what's right. Get out before I have you thrown out. Vaughn's jaw tightened. He looked at Grace one more time, something like an apology in his eyes, and then he left without another word. Grace felt despair wash over her. For a moment she'd thought, hoped, but Kane was right. One man couldn't stand against his power. That afternoon, Kane had business in town, and Grace was left with Mrs. Hendricks. The housekeeper set her to work mending linens, and Grace sat in the kitchen, pushing a needle through fabric and trying not to think about the future that awaited her. "That man who came this morning," she said quietly. "Vaughn, who is he?" Mrs. Hendricks glanced toward the door, then spoke softly. "Kieran Vaughn has a ranch about 10 miles north of here. Smaller operation, but he runs it honest. He and Mr. Kane have history. Bad blood over a water rights dispute a few years back. Mr. Kane tried to squeeze him out, but Vaughn wouldn't budge, he seemed." Grace trailed off, not sure how to describe the feeling she'd gotten. "Decent," Mrs. Hendricks finished. "He's a decent man, which is rare enough out here. But decent doesn't count for much against money and power." That night, Grace lay awake in her small room, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into sleep. She was almost dozing when she heard it, a soft tap on her window. Her heart jumped into her throat and she sat up, staring at the dark square of glass. Another tap. Grace went to the window and peered out. A figure stood in the shadows, barely visible. She recognized the shape of the hat, the set of the shoulders. Kieran Vaughn. Her hands shook as she unlatched the window and pushed it open. "What are you doing here?" she whispered. "Getting you out." His voice was low, urgent. "Can you climb through? If I get caught, you won't." Kane rode to town with most of his men. "There's only a couple hands watching the place, and I know their rounds. We have maybe 10 minutes. Grace didn't hesitate. She grabbed her carpet bag, already packed because she'd never unpacked, and pushed it through the window. Kieran caught it and set it aside, then held up his hands to help her through. The window was small and she had to twist and wriggle, but his hands were steady on her waist, guiding her. Her feet hit the ground and she stumbled. Kieran caught her, steadied her. Up close, she could see his face more clearly in the moonlight. Strong features, a scar above his left eyebrow, stubble on his jaw. He smelled like leather and sage and something clean. "Can you ride?" he whispered. "Yes." "Good. My horse is behind the barn. We need to move fast and quiet." They ran through the shadows, Grace's heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Behind the barn, a big bay stallion waited, ground tied and patient. Kieran handed her up into the saddle, then swung up behind her. His arm came around her waist, holding her secure, and he urged the horse forward at a quick walk that broke into a trot as soon as they cleared the ranch buildings. Grace looked back once, half expecting to hear shouts or gunfire, but there was nothing. Just the dark bulk of the Kane ranch receding into the night. They rode for what felt like hours. Kieran kept the horse at a steady pace, not too fast but not slow either, choosing his path carefully. Grace could feel the heat of his body behind her, solid and reassuring. She had trusted him without thought, without question, because something in her had recognized something in him. Safety, honesty, strength. Finally, as the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, they topped a rise and Grace saw buildings below. A ranch house, smaller than Kane's but well kept. A barn, a corral with horses, outbuildings neat and orderly. Smoke rose from the chimney. "This is my place," Kieran said. "You'll be safe here." They rode down into the yard and a man emerged from the barn, rifle in hand. When he saw Kieran, he lowered it. "Boss, heard you ride out in the night. Everything all right?" "Fine, Martinez. This is Miss Sullivan. She'll be staying with us for a while. See to the horse, will you?" Martinez looked curious but didn't ask questions. He took the reins as Kieran dismounted, then helped Grace down. Her legs were shaky from the long ride and the adrenaline, and Kieran kept a hand on her elbow until she was steady. "Come inside," he said. "You must be exhausted." The house was simple but comfortable. A main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area, doors leading to what must be bedrooms. It felt like a home, lived in and real, so different from Kane's showplace. A woman appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 60, with gray hair and kind eyes. "Kieran, I heard you come in." "Who's this?" "Mrs. Carson, this is Grace Sullivan." "Grace, this is my housekeeper, Mrs. Carson. Grace needs a place to stay, somewhere safe. Can you set up the spare room?" Mrs. Carson took one look at Grace's face and seemed to understand everything that wasn't being said. "Of course. You poor dear, you look done in. Come with me, let's get you settled." The spare room was small but clean, with a real bed and a window that looked out over the valley. Mrs. Carson brought her water to wash with and promised breakfast soon. "That man," Grace said softly. "Mr. Vaughn." "Why is he helping me?" Mrs. Carson smiled. "Because that's who he is. His father raised him right before he passed, taught him that strength is for protecting, not dominating. You're safe here, Miss Sullivan. Kieran won't let anything happen to you." After Mrs. Carson left, Grace sat on the edge of the bed and let herself shake. She was free. She had escaped Luther Kane, but she knew it wasn't over. Kane wouldn't let her go easily, and he certainly wouldn't forgive Kieran for taking her. She had just dragged this good man into her mess. But she was so tired, so bone-deep exhausted. She lay down just for a moment and sleep took her under like a wave. When she woke, the sun was high and streaming through the window. Grace sat up, disoriented for a moment, then remembered. She was at Kieran Vaughn's ranch. She was safe, at least for now. Someone had left clothes folded on a chair. A simple blouse and skirt, worn but clean and in far better condition than the dress she'd been wearing. Grace changed gratefully, then ventured out into the main room. Kieran sat at the table, papers spread before him. He looked up when she entered and his face softened. "You're awake. How do you feel?" "Like I'm not sure if this is real." "It's real." "Sit down, please. Mrs. Carson left food warming for you." Grace sat and Kieran served her. Eggs, bacon, fresh bread with butter. Simple food but prepared with care, and Grace realized she was starving. She ate while Kieran watched, his expression thoughtful. "We need to talk about what happens next," he said finally. Grace set down her fork. "I know Kane will come for me. He'll try. But he doesn't have any real claim on you. That contract your brothers signed, it's not legal. You can't sell a person, not anymore. But Kane has money and influence, and he might try to cause trouble anyway. I don't want to bring problems to your door." Kieran leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Luther Kane and I have been heading toward a reckoning for a long time. This just moved up the schedule. Don't worry about me, Miss Sullivan. I can handle Kane." "Grace," she said. "Please just call me Grace. Grace." He said her name carefully, like he was tasting it. "All right, and you should call me Kieran." "Why are you doing this?" The question came out softer than she intended. "You don't know me. I could be anyone. I know you didn't choose to be in this situation. I know your own family betrayed you. I know Kane is a bastard who uses his power to hurt people." He paused. "And I know what it's like to be alone and need help." There was a story there, Grace could tell, but before she could ask, they heard horses approaching. Kieran was on his feet instantly, his hand going to the gun belt he'd put back on. "Stay inside," he said, his voice hard now. Grace followed him to the window and peered out. Her heart sank. Luther Kane rode into the yard with 6 men, all armed. Kane's face was mottled with rage. Kieran stepped out onto the porch and Grace couldn't help herself. She followed, standing just behind him. "Vaughn," Kane shouted, "you stole my property. Send her out now or I'll burn this place to the ground." "She's not property," Kieran said, his voice calm and steady. "And she's not going anywhere. That contract is legal and binding. Her brothers sold her to me. A contract to sell a human being. No judge would uphold that, and you know it." Kane's face twisted. "I own the judges in this territory, not all of them. And even if you did, I'm not giving her back. You want her, you'll have to go through me." The air crackled with tension. Kane's men shifted in their saddles, hands near their guns. Grace could see Martinez and two other ranch hands emerging from the barn, armed as well. This was about to turn into a bloodbath. "Stop," Grace said, stepping forward. Kieran tried to block her, but she pushed past him. "Just stop. I won't be the cause of men dying." "Grace, get back inside," Kieran said urgently. She ignored him, walking down the porch steps until she stood in the yard between the two groups of armed men. "Mr. Kane, I will never willingly be your wife. Never. You could drag me back to your ranch, you could force a preacher to say words over us, but I will fight you every day for the rest of my life." "Is that really what you want?" Kane stared at her, his jaw working. "I paid good money for you. Then you wasted your money." "I'm not goods to be bought and sold. I'm a person. And I'm telling you now to your face that I will never belong to you." For a long moment, Kane said nothing. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. The contract. He stared at it, and Grace could see the war happening behind his eyes. Pride versus pragmatism. The need to win versus the reality that he'd already lost. Finally, he tore the paper in half. Then in half again. He threw the pieces on the ground. "Fine," he spat. "Keep her. But this isn't over, Vaughn. You've made an enemy today." "Had you as an enemy for years," Kieran said. "Nothing new there." Kane wheeled his horse around and galloped out of the yard, his men following. Grace stood watching them go, her whole body shaking now that the confrontation was over. She felt Kieran's hand on her shoulder, gentle and grounding. "That was brave," he said quietly, "and incredibly foolish. I couldn't let people die over me. Kane's not going to let this go, you know. He'll find other ways to make trouble." Grace turned to look up at him. His face was close, and she could see gold flecks in his blue eyes, see the concern written in every line of his expression. "I'm sorry. I've brought nothing but problems to you. You've brought nothing but yourself. And that's not a problem, Grace. That's just life happening." He smiled slightly. "Besides, things were getting boring around here." Over the next few weeks, Grace settled into life on Kieran's ranch. It was strange at first, not knowing what her place was, but Mrs. Carson put her to work helping with the household chores, and Grace was grateful for the occupation. She cooked and cleaned and mended, the same tasks she'd done for her worthless brothers, but here it felt different. Here, people thanked her. Kieran and his ranch hands appreciated the hot meals, the tidy house, the small comforts she provided. And slowly, she began to learn about the man who had saved her. Kieran ran his ranch with just 4 hands, including Martinez. It was a small operation compared to Kane's empire, but it was successful in its own way. Kieran bred horses, beautiful animals that he trained with patience and kindness, and he ran a modest herd of cattle. He worked alongside his men, never asking them to do anything he wouldn't do himself, and they respected him for it. He was quiet, Grace discovered. Not shy, but thoughtful, the kind of man who considered his words before he spoke them. He was fair in his dealings, honest in a way that seemed almost old-fashioned. And he was kind, though he tried to hide it behind a gruff exterior. She also learned that he was 28, had inherited the ranch from his father 5 years ago and had been running it alone ever since. When she asked why he'd never married, he just shrugged. "Never found the right woman, I guess. And I'm not the easiest man to live with. I'm set in my ways." They fell into a routine. Grace would make breakfast while Kieran and the hands did the morning chores. They'd all eat together at the big kitchen table, and then the men would go out to work the ranch while Grace and Mrs. Carson managed the house. In the evenings, after dinner, Kieran would sit by the fire and work on his books, the financial records of the ranch, and Grace would sit nearby with her mending or a book from his small collection. It was during those quiet evenings that they really talked. Grace told him about growing up, about her mother who had been gentle and strong, about her father who had been a dreamer and a poor rancher, about how everything had fallen apart after her parents died, how her brothers had squandered what little they had. Kieran told her about his own childhood, about a father who had taught him the value of hard work and integrity, about the early years of building the ranch, the struggles and the small victories, about his dispute with Kane, which had started over water rights but had become something deeper, a fundamental clash of values and worldviews. "Kane thinks power is about dominating others," Kieran said one night, staring into the fire. "Taking what he wants, crushing anyone who stands against him. My father taught me that real power is about protecting, about using your strength to help those who can't help themselves." "Is that why you came for me?" Grace asked softly. He turned to look at her, and something in his eyes made her breath catch. "I came for you because leaving you there would have been wrong. Because I couldn't sleep knowing Kane had you." He paused. "And because from the moment I saw you standing in his study, looking like you'd fight the devil himself if you had to, I knew you were someone worth fighting for." The air between them shifted, became charged with something neither of them had named yet. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks, and she looked down at her mending, her hands suddenly clumsy. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." But the peace couldn't last. A week later, trouble came in a different form. Grace was in the kitchen with Mrs. Carson when they heard shouting from the yard. They rushed to the window and saw 3 men on horseback. With a jolt, Grace recognized them. Thomas, James, and William, her brothers. Kieran was already outside, his stance protective. Martinez and the other hands were nearby, watching. "What do you want?" Kieran's voice carried through the window. "We want our sister," Thomas said. He looked sober for once, and that somehow made it worse. "You had no right to take her." "I had every right. You sold her like she was livestock. We were desperate. We had debts." Thomas looked past Kieran to the house, and Grace knew he could see her in the window. "Gracie, please, come home. We're sorry. We'll make it right." Grace felt Mrs. Carson's hand on her arm, but she shook it off. She went to the door and walked out onto the porch. All 3 of her brothers stared at her, and she saw shame and pleading in their faces. "You're sorry," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "You're sorry. You sold me to a man like Kane, and you're sorry." "We didn't know what else to do," William said. He was the youngest, just 22, and there were tears on his face. "We were going to lose everything. So you thought you'd lose me instead, your sister. The person who had taken care of you, cooked for you, held this family together after Mama and Papa died." Grace felt her own tears coming, hot and furious. "You didn't even give me a choice. You just handed me over like I was nothing." "You're our blood," James said. "You belong with family." "Family," Grace laughed, bitter and harsh. "You're not my family. Family doesn't do what you did. You're strangers to me now, worse than strangers." "Gracie," Thomas started. "Don't call me that. Don't ever call me that again. You have no right." She took a breath, steadying herself. "I'm not coming back with you. I'm never coming back with you. And if you ever set foot on this property again, I'll have you thrown off. Do you understand?" Thomas's face hardened. "You can't just stay here. People will talk. You're an unmarried woman living with an unmarried man. Your reputation will be ruined." My reputation. Grace felt something break inside her, a last fragile thread of connection to these men who shared her blood. "You sold me to settle a gambling debt, and you're worried about my reputation. Get out. Get off this land and never come back." They sat there for another moment, and Grace wondered if they'd actually try to take her by force. But Kieran stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun belt in a gesture that wasn't quite a threat but close to it. "You heard her," he said quietly. "Time for you to leave." Thomas looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Kieran's face must have convinced him. The three brothers turned their horses and rode away, and Grace watched them go with a feeling of finality settling in her chest. That chapter of her life was closed. Whatever came next, it wouldn't include them. When they were out of sight, Grace's knees buckled. Kieran caught her before she fell, his arms strong around her. She buried her face in his chest and cried great wrenching sobs that came from somewhere deep inside. He held her through it, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring soft words she couldn't quite hear but felt anyway. When the storm passed, she pulled back, embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I got your shirt all wet." "I don't care about the shirt." His hands were still on her arms, steadying her. "Are you all right?" "I don't know. I think so. I just—" She looked up at him, at this man who had become her anchor in the chaos. "They were right about one thing. People will talk. Me being here, living under your roof, it's not proper. Let them talk. I don't care what people think." "But I do, not for myself, but for you. You've already made an enemy of Kane because of me. I don't want your reputation damaged too." Kieran was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes searching her face. "There's a solution," he said finally. "If you want it." Grace's heart skipped. "What solution?" "You could marry me." The world seemed to tilt. "What? Marry me? Make it official and proper. Then no one could say anything and you'd be protected. Kane couldn't touch you, your brothers couldn't claim you." He paused and something vulnerable flickered across his face. "And I'd get to keep you here where I want you." Grace stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "Kieran, you can't just marry me to protect my reputation. That's not a good reason. It's not the only reason." His hands tightened slightly on her arms. "Grace, these past few weeks with you here, it's been the happiest I've been in years. I like coming in from work and finding you in the kitchen. I like sitting by the fire with you in the evenings. I like the way you make this house feel like a home instead of just a place I sleep." He took a breath. "I'm not good with words, and maybe this is too fast, but I think I'm falling in love with you. And if you could ever feel the same way about me, then I'd be honored to be your husband. Not just to protect you, but because I want you to be mine and I want to be yours." Grace felt tears spilling down her cheeks again, but these were different. These were tears of something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten the name of it. Hope. Joy. The feeling of being wanted for herself, not for what she could provide or what she was worth. "I think I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered. "I think I've been since that morning you walked into Kane's study and looked at me like I mattered." Kieran smiled, and it transformed his whole face. He cupped her cheek with one calloused hand, his thumb brushing away her tears. "Is that a yes?" "Yes. Yes, I'll marry you." He kissed her then, soft and careful, like she was something precious. Grace kissed him back, her hands fisting in his shirt, and felt the last pieces of her broken heart start to knit back together. This man had saved her, not just from Kane, but from a life of emptiness and defeat. He had given her hope and safety and something to believe in again. When they finally pulled apart, they were both smiling. Mrs. Carson was standing on the porch with tears in her eyes, and Martinez was grinning from where he stood by the barn. "Guess we're having a wedding," Kieran called out, and his men whooped and cheered. They were married a week later in the little church in Randsburg. It was a small ceremony, just Kieran's ranch hands and a few friends from town, plus Mrs. Carson, who cried through the entire thing. Grace wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Carson had helped her make, and Kieran wore his best suit, looking uncomfortable but happy. The preacher, an old man named Reverend Walker, smiled at them kindly as they stood before him. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." Grace barely heard the words. She was too focused on Kieran, on the way he looked at her like she was the only person in the world. When it came time for the vows, his voice was steady and sure. "I, Kieran Vaughn, take you, Grace Sullivan, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, protect you, and stand by you through whatever comes. I promise to never let anyone hurt you again. I promise to build a life with you, a good life, full of everything we can make it. This I swear before God and these witnesses." Grace's voice shook, but she got through her own vows. "I, Grace Sullivan, take you, Kieran Vaughn, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you with everything I have. I promise to make your house a home, to stand beside you through hard times and good. I promise to trust you, to honor you, and to be grateful every day that you chose me. This I swear before God and these witnesses." Reverend Walker pronounced them man and wife, and when Kieran kissed her, Grace felt the last chains of her past fall away. She was no longer Grace Sullivan, the unwanted sister, the woman sold to pay debts. She was Grace Vaughn, wife to a good man, standing at the beginning of a new life. The celebration afterward was simple but joyful. Mrs. Carson had prepared a feast, and they ate and drank and laughed until the sun set. Martinez played a guitar, and Kieran surprised Grace by pulling her into a dance right there in the yard under the stars. "I didn't know you could dance," she said, laughing as he spun her. "I can't, not really, but I figured I should try for my wedding day. You're doing fine." He pulled her close and they swayed together to the music. "Happy?" he asked softly. "Happier than I ever thought I could be." That night, Kieran carried her over the threshold of their home. Their home. The word still felt strange and wonderful. He set her down gently in the bedroom, the room that had been his alone but was now theirs together. "Are you nervous?" he asked, his hand still on her waist. "A little," Grace admitted. "Are you terrified?" But he was smiling. "I want this to be good for you, Grace. I want everything to be good for you. It will be, because it's you." They came together slowly, carefully, learning each other. Kieran was gentle, patient, making sure Grace was comfortable every step of the way. And when they finally joined, when they became truly husband and wife, Grace felt a completeness she hadn't known she was missing. This was what love was supposed to be: partnership, tenderness, trust. Afterward, they lay tangled together, Kieran's arms around her, Grace's head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "I love you," he said into the darkness. "I love you too. I'm going to spend every day making sure you never regret choosing me." Grace propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "I already know I won't. You saved me, Kieran. You gave me back my life." "No," he said seriously. "You saved yourself. I just got lucky enough to be there when you needed someone." The next few months were the happiest of Grace's life. She threw herself into making the ranch house a true home, adding small touches that made it warm and welcoming. She planted a garden, grew vegetables and herbs, even convinced Kieran to let her have some chickens. She learned the rhythms of ranch life, the endless cycle of work and seasons. And she learned her husband. Learned that he was stubborn about some things but willing to listen about others. That he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh. That he was thoughtful and considerate, always making sure she had what she needed. That he loved her with a quiet, steady devotion that made her feel safe in a way she never had before. They had their disagreements, of course. Grace wanted to get more involved in the business side of the ranch, and Kieran was initially hesitant. used to doing things his own way. But when she showed him her head for numbers, how she could organize his chaotic record-keeping system, he relented. They became true partners, working together to build the ranch into something even better. But Kane's shadow still hung over them. He kept his distance, but they heard stories from town. Kane was angry, bitter about losing face. He was spreading rumors, trying to damage Kieran's reputation, painting him as a cattle thief and worse. Most people who knew Kieran didn't believe the lies, but they caused trouble anyway. Then came the day when Martinez rode in fast from town, his face grim. "Boss, you need to hear this. Kane's filed papers with the territorial government. He's claiming your water rights, says your ranch is taking more than its legal share and damaging his herd." Kieran's jaw tightened. "That's garbage. We've always stayed within our allocation." "I know that. You know that. But Kane's got lawyers and he's pushing this hard. There's going to be a hearing in Bakersfield next month." Grace watched her husband's face close off, becoming hard and distant. "Then I'll go to Bakersfield and fight it." "I'm coming with you," Grace said immediately. "Grace, it could be dangerous. If Kane's really looking for a fight, then you'll need someone watching your back. I'm your wife, Kieran. Where you go, I go." They stared at each other and finally Kieran nodded. "All right. We go together." The trip to Bakersfield took 2 days by stage. Grace had never been so far from home, and she watched the landscape change with wide eyes. Kieran sat beside her, tense and quiet, clearly dreading the confrontation to come. The hearing was held in the territorial courthouse, a grand building that intimidated Grace with its marble floors and high ceilings. Kane was there with 2 lawyers, well-dressed men with sharp eyes. Kieran had a single lawyer, an older man named Patterson who had a reputation for honesty but not much else. The proceeding was technical and boring, full of legal language Grace barely understood. But the gist was clear. Kane was claiming that Kieran's ranch was diverting water that rightfully belonged to Kane's property, and he wanted the territorial government to restrict Kieran's access. Patterson presented their case, showing surveys and water flow measurements, proving that Kieran had never taken more than his legal share. But Kane's lawyers twisted everything, raised doubts, suggested that Kieran was manipulating the evidence. It was looking bad. Grace could see the territorial judge frowning, could see Kane's satisfied expression. And then she remembered something. Something Mrs. Carson had mentioned weeks ago in passing. She leaned over to Kieran. "The old property maps, the ones your father had, do you still have them?" "Yes, but they're back at the ranch. They show the original water rights, don't they? Before Kane bought up all that land to the south." Kieran's eyes widened. "Yes. They show that Kane's new sections never had primary water rights. He's only entitled to overflow." He turned to Patterson. "We need to request a continuance. I have evidence back at my ranch that will settle this." The judge looked irritated, but agreed to reconvene in 2 weeks. Kieran immediately sent a telegram to Martinez, telling him exactly which maps to find and bring to Bakersfield. That night in their hotel room, Grace and Kieran sat by the window looking out at the unfamiliar city. "You saved us today," Kieran said quietly. "If you hadn't remembered those maps. We're partners, remember. Your fights are my fights." He pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "I'm so grateful I found you, or you found me. However it worked. We found each other," Grace said. "And now we're going to beat Kane together." 2 weeks later, they were back in the courthouse. Martinez had delivered the old maps and Patterson laid them out before the judge. They were clear and unambiguous. The water rights for Kieran's ranch predated Kane's acquisitions, and Kane's new land only had secondary rights to whatever water wasn't being used. Kane's lawyers tried to argue, but there was no getting around the evidence. The judge ruled in Kieran's favor, not only dismissing Kane's claim, but also ordering him to pay court costs for bringing a frivolous suit. Kane's face when the ruling came down was a study in barely controlled rage. As they left the courthouse, he caught up with them on the steps. "This isn't over, Vaughn." "Yeah, it is," Kieran said calmly. "You lost. Accept it and move on. You took something that belonged to me, both of you." His eyes flicked to Grace with pure venom. "Nobody takes from Luther Kane and gets away with it." "I never belonged to you," Grace said firmly. "I never will, and you need to let this go before you destroy yourself." Kane leaned in close, his voice low and menacing. "I will see you both ruined. However long it takes, whatever it costs, I will take everything from you." "Is that a threat, Kane?" Patterson had come up behind them, along with several other people from the courthouse. "Because I heard it, and so did all these witnesses." Kane looked around, realized he had an audience and pulled back. "Just a promise between old acquaintances," he said, forcing a smile. He walked away, but Grace shivered despite the heat. "He means it," she said softly. "He's not going to stop." "Then we'll deal with whatever comes," Kieran said, "together." They returned to the ranch to find everything running smoothly. Mrs. Carson had held down the fort and the hands had kept up with all the work. Life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be with the knowledge that Kane was out there somewhere, plotting. But weeks passed, then months, and nothing happened. Spring turned to summer, summer to fall. Grace began to hope that maybe Kane had finally given up, moved on to other schemes. She also began to suspect she might be pregnant. Her monthly courses had stopped, and she'd been feeling queasy in the mornings. She didn't want to say anything to Kieran until she was sure, but the possibility filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. Mrs. Carson confirmed it one morning after Grace had to run outside to be sick for the third day in a row. "You're carrying, dear. About 2 months along, I'd say." "How do I tell Kieran?" "Just tell him. That man will be over the moon." That evening after dinner, Grace took Kieran's hand and led him outside to the porch where they'd first talked, where they'd started to fall in love. "I have something to tell you," she said, her heart pounding. He looked worried. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right. Kieran, I'm pregnant. We're going to have a baby." For a moment he just stared at her. Then a smile broke across his face, so wide and genuine it made him look years younger. He let out a whoop of joy and picked her up, spinning her around until she was laughing and dizzy. "We're having a baby. Really? Are you sure?" "I'm sure." Mrs. Carson confirmed it today. He set her down carefully like she might break. "Grace, my Grace, you've made me the happiest man alive." He placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Our child, part you, part me, a new life. Are you ready to be a father? I don't know, probably not, but I'll learn." He kissed her softly. "We'll learn together." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Grace continued to work, though Kieran and Mrs. Carson both fussed over her constantly, trying to get her to rest more. By winter, her belly was round and prominent, and they spent the long evenings talking about names and making plans for the nursery. And then, on a cold January night, Kane made his move. Grace woke to the smell of smoke. She sat up in bed, confused and disoriented. Beside her, Kieran was already moving, pulling on his pants and boots. "Fire," he said grimly. "The barn's on fire." They rushed outside to find flames engulfing the barn, hungry and bright against the night sky. The horses were screaming inside, and Kieran ran toward the flames without hesitation. Martinez and the other hands were already there, throwing water from buckets, but it was clearly not enough. "The horses!" Kieran shouted. He grabbed a wet blanket, threw it over his head, and plunged into the burning building. Grace watched in horror as flames licked up the sides of the barn, as smoke billowed out thick and black. Other horses came running out, wild-eyed with fear, but Kieran didn't emerge. Seconds stretched into minutes, and Grace felt her heart stop beating. Then he appeared, leading his stallion and 2 other horses. His clothes were singed, his face black with soot, but he was alive. Grace ran to him, throwing her arms around him despite the heat and smoke. "Don't ever do that to me again," she sobbed. "Had to save the horses." He coughed, deep and harsh. "Is everyone accounted for?" They did a head count. All the hands were safe, all the horses except one older gelding who had succumbed to the smoke. The barn itself was a total loss, collapsing in on itself in a shower of sparks. "How did it start?" Grace asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. Martinez confirmed her suspicion. "Found this on the ground nearby. Kerosene can. This wasn't an accident, boss. Someone set this deliberately." Kieran's face went hard as stone. "Kane." "You don't know that for sure," Patterson's voice said. Grace turned to see their lawyer riding up, having spotted the fire from town. "You can't accuse a man like Kane without proof." "Who else would it be?" Kieran demanded. "He threatened us. He said he'd destroy us. This is him making good on that promise." "But you can't prove it, and without proof, accusing him will just make things worse." Patterson looked genuinely sympathetic. "I know it's not fair, but Kane has too much power. He'll deny everything, and it'll be your word against his. So he just gets away with it." Grace felt rage burning hotter than the fire. "He tries to kill us, kills one of our horses, destroys our barn, and there's no consequence. Not unless you can find evidence linking him to the fire. A witness, a connection to whoever said it, something concrete." They spent the next week trying to do exactly that. Kieran rode into town, asked questions, tried to find out if anyone had seen Kane's men near the ranch. But no one had seen anything, or if they had, they weren't talking. Kane's reach was too long, his intimidation too effective. The ranch had to rebuild. The barn was gone, so they had to construct temporary shelters for the animals. It was expensive, time-consuming work, and it put a strain on their finances. Grace watched Kieran grow more and more frustrated, watched the stress eat at him. But worse than the financial strain was the fear. If Kane would burn their barn, what else might he do? Grace was heavily pregnant now, due any day, and the thought of Kane striking while she was vulnerable terrified her. She was hanging laundry one morning when the pain started, sharp, cramping sensations that took her breath away. "Mrs. Carson took one look at her face and knew. "It's time. Get inside, dear. I'll fetch the midwife." The labor was long and hard. Grace had never experienced pain like this, waves of agony that seemed to break her apart. Kieran held her hand through it all, whispering encouragement, looking more terrified than she'd ever seen him. Finally, after hours that felt like days, Mrs. Carson placed a tiny, squalling bundle in her arms. "It's a boy," she said, smiling through tears. Grace looked down at her son, at his red, wrinkled face and tiny fists, and felt a love so fierce it was almost painful. "Kieran, look at him. He's perfect." Kieran touched the baby's hand with one finger, and their son immediately grasped it. "He's so small, so perfect." His voice was choked with emotion. "What should we name him?" They'd discussed names for months but never quite settled on one. But looking at her son now, Grace knew. "James. We'll call him James after your father." "James Vaughn," Kieran said, testing the name. "I like it." "James, you've got big boots to fill, little man. Your grandfather was the finest man I ever knew. We'll do our best to raise you right." The next few weeks passed in a blur of feedings and diaper changes and sleepless nights. James was a healthy baby with good lungs, and he made his needs known loudly and frequently. But Grace had never been happier. Her little family, safe under one roof, was everything she'd ever wanted. She should have known it couldn't last. It was March when Kane made his next move. This time, it wasn't direct violence but something more insidious. Word came from town that Kane had called in all his markers, all the debts owed to him by various merchants and businessmen, and he was using that leverage to organize a boycott. No one in Randsburg would buy Kieran's horses or sell him supplies. He was being economically strangled. "We can't survive without being able to sell our stock," Kieran said, pacing their bedroom while Grace nursed James. "And if we can't buy supplies, we can't keep the ranch running." "What about Bakersfield or other towns? Too far. The cost of transport would eat up any profit." He ran a hand through his hair. "Damn it, Kane's finally found a way to hurt us that doesn't leave fingerprints. There has to be something we can do, some way to fight back." But days passed with no solution. Their savings dwindled. The hands started looking nervous, worried about whether they'd get paid. Grace watched her husband grow gaunt with stress, watched him age before her eyes. She was sitting on the porch with James one afternoon, trying to enjoy the spring sunshine despite everything, when she saw a rider approaching. She tensed, half expecting it to be one of Kane's men, but as the figure got closer she recognized him. Reverend Walker from the church. The old preacher dismounted stiffly and tipped his hat to her. "Mrs. Vaughn, is your husband home? He's in the south pasture. I can send someone to fetch him." "I'd appreciate that. I have some news that concerns you both." When Kieran arrived, dusty and wary, Reverend Walker got straight to the point. "I heard about the boycott Kane's organized. It's wrong, and several of us in town think so too. We've been talking and we have a proposition." "I'm listening," Kieran said. "There are folks in this territory who don't like how Kane operates. He's made a lot of enemies over the years with his strong-arm tactics. We're willing to defy his boycott quietly. We'll buy your horses, sell you supplies. We'll have to be discreet about it, but we can keep you afloat until Kane gets tired of this game." Grace felt hope flutter in her chest. "Why would you risk Kane's anger for us?" Reverend Walker smiled. "Because sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. And because you too have shown this community what real integrity looks like. You took in a woman who needed help, stood up to a bully, and built something good here. That's worth protecting. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was enough." The network of people willing to defy Kane was small but dedicated. They bought Kieran's horses through intermediaries, supplied goods through back channels. It was harder, more expensive, less efficient than normal commerce, but it kept the ranch alive. And slowly, something else started to happen. Other people, seeing that some were willing to stand against Kane, began to find their own courage. A few merchants quietly resumed doing business with Kieran. Some ranchers who'd been victimized by Kane in the past started speaking up, sharing their stories. Kane's absolute power, it turned out, had been built partly on fear. And fear, once challenged, could crumble. By summer, the boycott had effectively collapsed. Kane still had influence, still had power, but he no longer controlled everything and everyone. People had remembered that they didn't have to bow to a bully. Kane himself seemed to recognize his defeat. Grace saw him in town one day, looking older and somehow diminished. Their eyes met across the street, and for a moment she thought he might approach her. But then he just turned and walked away, and Grace knew with certainty that this time, it really was over. That evening, she told Kieran what she'd seen. They were sitting on the porch again, their favorite spot, watching James toddle around the yard under Mrs. Carson's watchful eye. "I think he's finally given up," Grace said. "I think we've won." Kieran pulled her close. "We survived, not sure that's the same as winning. We have each other, we have our son, we have this life we've built. That's winning." He kissed the top of her head. "You're right. You're always right." "How did I get so lucky?" "You walked into a bad man's study and saw someone who needed help. You tore up a piece of paper and gave me my freedom. That wasn't luck, Kieran. That was you being who you are. Best decision I ever made, taking you home that day. Best decision I ever made was saying yes when you asked me to marry you." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over their land, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. James came running over, his little legs still unsteady, and Kieran scooped him up, making him giggle. "You know," Grace said thoughtfully, "Mrs. Carson thinks I might be pregnant again." Kieran nearly dropped their son. "Really? Already? James is almost a year old. It's not that surprising." She smiled at his shocked expression. "How do you feel about it?" Terrified, thrilled, both at once. He grinned. "Our family's growing. We'll need to add on to the house soon. We'll manage. We always do." The years that followed were full, busy, rich with life. Grace gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Rose after Grace's mother. Then 2 years later, another son, Thomas, and Grace could use that name now without pain, because this Thomas would be nothing like the brother who had betrayed her. The ranch prospered. With Kane no longer actively working against them, Kieran's horse breeding operation gained a reputation throughout the territory. People came from as far as Los Angeles to buy his animals. They built a new barn, bigger and better than the one that had burned. They added rooms to the house to accommodate their growing family. Grace became a fixture in Randsburg society, respected for her strength and kindness. She organized charity drives for families in need, taught Sunday school at the church, became someone that other women came to for advice. The girl who had been sold like property became a pillar of the community, and through it all, her love for Kieran only deepened. They had their arguments, their difficult moments, the stress of raising children and running a ranch. But the foundation they'd built that first night when he'd carried her away from Kane's ranch never wavered. They were partners, lovers, best friends. They had saved each other, and they continued to save each other every day. Grace never saw her brothers again. She heard through the grapevine that Thomas had finally drunk himself to death, that James had left the territory, and that William had married and settled down with a wife who kept him away from the gambling tables. She felt a distant sadness for them, but no real grief. They had made their choices, and she had made hers. Luther Kane faded from prominence. His ranch declined, some said because he couldn't keep good help, others because he'd made too many enemies. Eventually, he sold out and moved to San Francisco. Grace heard he died there in 1895, alone and unmourned. She didn't celebrate his death, but she didn't mourn it either. He had been a chapter in her story that was long since closed. On a warm evening in June of 1898, Grace and Kieran sat on their porch, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. James had married a sweet girl from town and given them 2 grandsons. Rose had married a rancher from up north and had a daughter. Thomas was courting a young woman but hadn't proposed yet. 15 years, Kieran said, taking Grace's hand. "Seems impossible. 15 years since you rode into Kane's ranch and changed my life. We changed each other's lives." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him. Her hair was starting to show threads of silver now, and Kieran's temples were going gray. They both moved a little slower, felt the aches and pains that came with middle age, but the essential things hadn't changed. They still loved each other. They still worked side by side. They still sat on this porch in the evenings and talked about their day. "You ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Taking me in, standing up to Kane, all the trouble it caused?" Kieran turned to look at her, and his blue eyes were as clear and honest as they'd been that first day. "Not for 1 second. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Grace Vaughn. You and our children and this life we've built. I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. Even the fire." even the boycott, even all of that, because it led us here to this moment, to this life. And I wouldn't change a single thing about this life. Grace kissed him, soft and sweet, tasting home and love and forever. I love you, Kieran Vaughn. Thank you for tearing up that paper. Thank you for bringing me home. Thank you for saying yes, for building this home with me, for giving me everything. Inside the house, they could hear Mrs. Carson, ancient now but still keeping their household running, calling that dinner was ready. Their children and grandchildren would be arriving soon for their weekly family meal. The table would be crowded and loud, full of laughter and arguing and love. Grace took Kieran's hand, and they stood together, walking into their home, into the life they had built from ashes and hope. She had been sold like property, treated as worthless, betrayed by her own blood. But she had been saved by a good man who saw her value, who gave her freedom and love and a future. And in the end, that was all any love story really needed to be. Two people finding each other in the darkness, choosing each other every day, building something beautiful from the broken pieces of their past. Grace and Kieran Vaughn walked into their house, into the warmth and noise of their family, and closed the door on the past. The future stretched before them, bright with possibility, rich with love, full of all the things that mattered most. They had survived. They had thrived. They had won. And they lived truly and completely, happily ever after.